I'm with Neil Hamilton, AM for Mid and West Wales. Neil, things seem to be on the up. Boris Johnson is back in office, if that's a positive or not. And the Welsh Assembly is sort of getting back to business, albeit online. Are you confident that people are getting the correct information relating to the coronavirus, specifically the number of infections and deaths in hospitals, care homes and in private residences? Are you briefed on this on a daily basis?
Well, no, we're not briefed on it, to be honest. I'm not really getting any more information than you are, and which is publicly available. We have a statement once a week from Mark Drakeford and Vaughan Gething, and the Welsh Government obviously has press conferences in between. But the statistics that we are getting are the same ones as you see on the Public Health Wales website, the Office for National Statistics and so on. And I think the way those statistics have been collected leaves a great deal to be desired. If, as you know, the only deaths that have been recorded by the Office for National Statistics have been deaths in hospital, leaving those dying in nursing homes out of the picture. Well, we hear from the news today that there's been a trebling of deaths in nursing homes in the last few weeks, quite understandably, because they are the most vulnerable parts of the population. And once an infection gets into a nursing home, lots of people are likely to be affected. So the statistics themselves have not given us the full picture. And on the Public Health Wales website, even between health boards in Wales, the picture looks dramatically different. And in Hywel Dda, for example, you'd think that coronavirus had hardly hit at all, because Public Health Wales is saying that we've had 13 deaths for every million people that live in the Hywel Dda catchment area. And yet for Aneurin in Devon, it's 372 deaths. That's 30 times as many. Well, it's not conceivable that the difference between West Wales and Cardiff is so great. And of course it isn't. It's just that the information which is fed in is not adequate to give us a proper picture of what's going on in the real world. So that's much to be deplored, I think, because people who are trying to model the way this disease is progressing and what its impact on public services might be, for example, are producing false models because they haven't got accurate information to go on.
It's a double-edged sword, really, isn't it? Because on the one hand, you say, okay, well, it would be actually, giving people confidence, saying, well, oh, look, the figures are relatively low. And on the other hand, maybe in 3 or 4 months' time, we're going to see this massive announcement spike in the percentages because of the very fact that you're saying there, we're not getting all the reports in.
No, well, the true picture is now coming out because the deaths which are registered throughout the country are being ascribed to coronavirus, and they differ markedly with the information which has been collected by governmental authorities from the hospital and other health-related areas. So we will know from the ONS figures, but they are, of course, 2 or 3 weeks late because of the time it takes to register deaths and compile the information. So there's a gap then between what's really going on in the world and the statistics upon which people who are trying to forecast the future are relying. Over time, this will become less important because we'll have a bigger backlog of information on which we can base things. But given that this is a fast-moving situation and the curve of infection and death is already flattening and hopefully will decline as rapidly as it has risen, then we are not able to use the information to the best effect. And that's much to be deplored. And I think if we're going to keep people's confidence in order to get them to continue obeying the lockdown and social distancing and all the rest of it, then we've got to produce accurate information which people can trust and rely on, because otherwise, if they think that they're being kept indoors unnecessarily or for too long, then they'll start to breach the guidelines and the regulations. And I think there's evidence that that's happening already.
Yeah. The field hospitals around the world tend to be empty, built at great expense, often with a temporary sort of fixing in mind in stadiums and so on.
Yes.
Do you know what the criteria is for admission to these places? I mean, hindsight's a wonderful thing, but do you think we should have been looking at a far more long-term plan, given that this thing might come back year year on year instead of putting them in, 15 million in Swansea for a temporary hospital. I don't know how many millions in Llanelli and Carmarthenshire for temporary hospitals in rugby stadiums that really want to go back to business as soon as this is over. So that's going to be emptied very quickly. Is this a waste of money, Neil?
Well, I suppose we should be thankful that these beds are not being used and that the health service can cope with the facilities that it's got. That's, I suppose, a tribute to the lockdown. But once the lockdown starts to be relaxed, of course, there is a danger that the number of cases will start to rise again. But I can see your point that, of course, this is money down the drain because football stadiums are not going to become part of the health service permanently, are they?
No.
So all the facilities which have been created there will have to be dismantled. I suppose because of the speed of this crisis coming upon us and the scale of it, it might be understandable that these temporary measures have been taken. But I think it is certainly a shame that we are presumably wasting hundreds of millions of pounds throughout the United Kingdom on facilities which are not going to be used. But then I suppose it's a kind of insurance policy in a way, but it's a pity that we can't secure any kind of long-term benefit out of this. There must have been other premises which could be used on a smaller scale, which could have remained part of our health service for the future. There are lots of cottage hospital type of places or maybe nursing homes which could have been used in this way.
Let's look at the economy then. Donald Trump said the US will see more death by keeping the economy shut down than by coronavirus. Is that something you concur with? Do you think this is getting desperate now? Are we going to see enormous tax hikes, council tax bill hikes, the economy spiralling downwards to a huge recession? Should people be worried now about the economy?
Yes, I think we should, because the scale of the shock to the economy, which has been administered deliberately by the government, is actually much greater than the Great Depression in the 1930s, proportionately. Of course, we were a much poorer country getting on for 100 years ago than we are today. But nevertheless, the scale of the disruption is going to be easily equal to the stock market crash fallout after 1931. The Office for National Statistics is forecasting that our GDP, national income, is going to fall by a third in the second half of this year. And if the lockdown isn't lifted substantially sometime soon, it's going to lead to a 15% drop in our national income for the whole of next year. And to put that into perspective, in the 1930s, our GDP fell for 6 straight quarters, and that's much the same as the financial crisis of 10 years ago. And it took, in the 30s, 4 years for our GDP to recover to its previous peak. In the financial crisis of 10 years ago, it took 5 years. And we've got a shutdown which is twice as bad as it was in the 1930s and twice as bad as it was 10 years ago. So this could lead to massive disruption in the economy. There are lots of firms which have shut down and will never reopen. They'll need to have a completely new business model or indeed a completely new business as a result of this. Maybe this is just accelerating forces which might have happened anyway. Just take the high street for an example. We know that the high street's in crisis, and big firms like Debenhams and others have shut their doors. But this is going to make it even more difficult for the remaining firms on the high street to survive. And the longer this goes on, the more difficult it will be for them to emerge from it in any kind of shape to continue trading. And that has much bigger impacts beyond those firms themselves, because their employees spend money in other places on other things. The property companies that own the buildings in which these businesses are operating will themselves have financing problems, perhaps. So that has implications for the property market throughout the country. And so many of people's principal assets is in the bricks and mortar in which they live. So people's feeling of well-being is going to be affected by that as well. So who knows how this is going to play out? It will take years, I think, for us to measure the full effect and to recover. In the meantime, the government needs to take some very drastic measures to relieve the burdens on businesses. The overhead costs that government imposes on things like business rates or employers' national insurance, the stamp duty on property purchases, all these things I think need to be scrapped for the short term in order to make it easier for businesses to survive and get back into shape.
Yeah. Let's look at education then. We know that most people now are homeschooling, not really the flavour of the month for the Welsh Assembly. To a certain extent, homeschooling, they were not pretty positive about it during the time when education was up and running. Do you have any concerns about those people who have been homeschooling for quite some time, who've not had any financial support and maybe off the radar for this now? Are any benefits that are there? Free school meals, the support. I know that the hub is up and running. A lot of people are being critical about the hub, saying it's all text, it's hard to manipulate, hard to manoeuvre, hard to get any understanding. Listening to conversations today in Buryport from parents talking about what's happening from their schools. They're not happy. They're saying, look, we're just being sent home, this sort of homogenised work for year 8 and that's it. We're not teachers. We don't know what's going on here. Have you got real concerns about the attainment gap widening given the time scale that we're going into now for education?
Yeah. Well, I'm in favour of people's right to homeschool if that's what they prefer to do, so long as basic educational standards are maintained, and I think that's perfectly possible to do. I think it's a good thing. I don't think that the state should have a monopoly of the education of our children. I think that would be a very bad thing if there was no alternative, and we know from the free school movement in England what a dramatic success that has been. And we do need to have this form of competition and comparison in order to measure the success or otherwise of our public education system. And as you know, in Wales, we've had the worst education results of any of the home nations of the UK going back for many years. Things have improved slightly, but we're still at the bottom of all the basic tables on numeracy, literacy, etc. So there's a lot that needs to be done to improve education in Wales. But I do think that online learning is going to be a very important element in the future. It makes it much easier for people to contract out of the state system if they want to, so long as the materials for teaching kids are there. And this could open up a golden opportunity, I think, for the future. And parents who want to take charge of their children's education for themselves, because they may not be satisfied with what they're being taught in school, then I'm all for it. But they've got to be adequately supported. And the thing about the Welsh Government is I think they're not interested in this because they want everything to be homogenised and nationalised. And I think that would be a very bad thing indeed.
Looking then at politics in general, we've seen at the county councils, local authorities, councillors are not there. Politicians are sat at home in front of their laptops, having their cups of tea and their apple pie, I'm sure, and eating it. Do you think this is sort of, to a certain extent, for some people, their perception will be, actually, we don't miss these people and they're not as relevant as maybe we thought they were? Do you envisage a lot of people coming out after this saying, let's downscale the Welsh Government, let's downscale the local authorities, or let's look at a different way of doing politics, maybe a far more localised way in which maybe, local authorities haven't got so much power over education, and maybe there are almost like a United States federal system where there are states and governors to a certain extent that look after that local economy, local education, local health. Do you think that's something we could look at?
I definitely do think that. We've got a Welsh Assembly election next year, and I'm going to be standing in that election on a policy of abolishing the Assembly and devolving powers further down. We've got devolution from London to Cardiff, but as far as the rest of Wales outside Cardiff is concerned, we might not have had any change at all. People in North Wales feel totally remote from the Cardiff-dominated institutions of government. People in West Wales do as well, I think. We've got a health service which consumes half of the Welsh Government budget, which is totally undemocratic. Where is the voice of the patient in the health service? Nowhere. We need to have democratically elected health boards in order to run the health service at a local level and give local priorities the precedence that they deserve. With schools, why should everything be ruled from County Hall and the County Education Department? I think that parents ought to play a much bigger part in governing schools and choosing the priorities for the school at a local level. Yes, there must be minimum standards of attainment, and that we've got a national curriculum which needs to be maintained, although there's scope for flexibility there as well. But I think that the way of the future is to involve real people at local level rather than have bureaucrats, civil servants and council officers deciding all the major policy decisions. So education is another quarter of Welsh Government. So health and education between them, 75% of everything that the Welsh Government spends money on and does. When you look at then what's left apart from that, it's a ragbag of odds and ends. So we don't really need to have this huge apparatus of government in Cardiff. We could do things much better on a more devolved, more flexible basis, get people more involved at the local level, because the more local services are and more localised you can make the decision-taking process, the more involvement you will get from ordinary people on the ground. The Welsh Government in Cardiff might be as far away as China as far as most people are concerned. They don't see it as responsive or flexible, the Welsh Assembly has hardly touched the nation's consciousness over huge swathes of the population. I mean, it's amazing that half the people of Wales, in an opinion poll not so long ago, thought that the health service was still part of the UK government's responsibility. Well, if after 20 years they haven't even conveyed that basic message over what they spend half their budget on, I think that's a recognition of total failure.
Neil, you're a lone voice in the Welsh Assembly at the moment. UKIP spent to a certain extent with the fact that you've achieved, albeit with other things have been achieved in Europe and Brexit and so on. So are you going to be running with this new flag, then, the Abolish the Welsh Assembly? Do you see it as a new party?
I was against devolution in the first place 20-odd years ago,
I know.
Because I thought it threatened the breakup of the United Kingdom, ultimately. Nationalist and separatist forces, I thought, would have an increased appetite rather than a reduced one by devolution, and that is indeed what we've seen in Scotland, less so in Wales. But it's also part of my long-term, what you might call libertarian agenda, which is to put power back in the hands of the people and not devolve to an intermediate rung of the ladder with localised bureaucrats taking the main decisions and running things. Why can't people run their own lives? It's our money, after all, that funds all this, taxpayers' money. So why shouldn't we, as we do in the rest of our lives, make these decisions for ourselves?
Where does that sit on the sort of political, monitor as such? Is it left, right? Is it centre? Where is this sort of thinking coming from?
Well, it's thinking that I've always had all my life. Back in the 1980s, we had a reform of the health service and reform of the education system when I was an MP. We gave more power to parents. We devolved power within the health service to regional and then district health authorities. Massive changes have taken place in the meantime. It's all gone back and forth, and it's been pretty chaotic. But the idea behind the whole thing was to put power back in the hands of those who consume the services, whether they be health or education or whatever else the state provides. There's no need for government to get in the way of people taking their own decisions. We make our own decisions about the rest of our lives, the kind of house that we want to live in, how we run our lives, who we work for, and how we bring up our children at home, etc., etc. Most parents are perfectly capable of making rational decisions about health matters and education matters, and it's only government that gets in the way. say, so long as we have a system of taxation and redistribution of wealth, which means that nobody is deprived of the necessities of life, and the government will give them the purchasing power to buy what they need, or at least to a basic level, then I see no reason why government should be the organisation which takes the decisions which matter most to people in their homes and in their lives, and that's the vision of society that I've always had. I grew up in the valleys where Labour ran everything, and this is the story of South Wales certainly for most of my life. But there are cracks in that mirror now. In the general election in December, Labour lost all their seats in North Wales, apart from Alyn and Deeside, which they retained with a majority of 200. Even in the Llanelli constituency, where Labour used to weigh the votes rather than count them back in the 1960s when I was a boy, they were reduced to a 5,000 majority over the Tories. I mean, that's inconceivable when I was a kid. And we got Plaid Cymru and UKIP got 12% of the vote in the last Assembly election. So the political system is very much more fragmented today than it used to be. And I see this as an opportunity, therefore, to get people to take more control over their own lives and get more involved in the process of decision-making, so that it's their money, they should see how it's spent.
Do you think that could relate to the media in Wales as well, then? Because we have a media that we are told scrutinises government and holds people to account. Do you think they're playing a game here? Do you think the history, the stories that have been written over the years have sort of weighed in the favour of the powerful and the great and the good, rather than the people you're talking about, the people at the bottom of the pile, to a certain extent, that maybe don't feel...
Well, I'm afraid, as far as the mainstream media is concerned, we have a monopoly in Wales, and they don't hold the government to account at all. They're only interested in trivia, and they'll just print whatever Welsh Government press releases tell them. And where there are scandals to be unearthed, you won't find them looking with a torchlight, let alone a magnifying glass. It's up to local, hyperlocal news services to find the stories, or blogs like, I don't know if you ever read Jack of the North, which is an excellent blog which really gets to the heart of what's wrong with the Cardiff Bay-controlled political system that we got in Wales, the jobs for the boys, back-scratching mentality, and all the incompetence which has produced massive waste of resources in recent years. So the real scrutiny is being provided by people who are very under-resourced, and if they had the resources of a major company like NewsQuest, for example, then they would be able to do so much more. But government advertising goes to the big boys, not to the little boys, and that needs to be changed as well. We need to succour our hyper-local news services. They should get a share of the government advertising revenue as well, and then they could improve their business model and be a more effective scrutineer of government, both in Cardiff and, more particularly, our county councils as well. There have been many things in Carmarthenshire, for example, which I think should have been investigated, but it was pointless expecting a Cardiff-based news agency to do it.
Do you think then, moving forward and looking ahead, that we are going to see things done very differently in all spheres of life, politics in particular, a lot more online? We hear this kind of campaign towards cutting down on CO2 emissions and so on. We're seeing a lot of positives coming out of this crisis to a certain extent, a lot of things that are highlighting or super highlighting what could be achieved. So if we look on that side of things, what are the positives you see going forward? What can be learned from this, and what can we do?
Well, I think that, this is a very dark cloud, but there is a silver lining of that kind. I've found how easy it is to do video conferencing by Zoom.
Yes.
Everybody seems to be doing this now, and even in the family. We have conferences with family members who are scattered all over the world, and we do this on a regular basis. The plenary session of the Assembly has happened once a week, where we're all sitting at home in our offices, and there we are up on the screen like Celebrity Squares, if you remember that quiz program in the 1970s.
Yeah.
And we've got a meeting of the Climate Change Committee, which I'm a member in the Assembly, coming up next week as well. For the first time, we'll have a committee session done by this means as well. I've had video conferences with the Howard Health Authority, with the Powys Health Board, with the David Powys Police, and others. And we've managed to operate perfectly adequately in this way. So this will certainly be a very important addition to the way in which we do business, if it isn't going to supplant the traditional methods completely. And I do think that this is going to lead to a completely different business model for lots of people who've found that their businesses can prosper better without huge quantities of bricks and mortar, and so online shopping obviously will have a great impetus as a result of this crisis. We're even our local village shop is now acting as a kind of go-between for the things that we would normally go to the supermarket for, and fruit and vegetables and fresh food particularly. And so I think a whole new market is developing there as well. So in a way, I think this is much to be welcomed. It could bring more life back to our villages, and of course the high street, as we've known it, is a thing of the past. It's not going to go back to what it was. So again, the centres of our towns and cities will look very different, perhaps in 10 years, from what they look now. But it could end up as being much more convenient for people in due course, because you can do things much more easily from home and at leisure than you were able to do previously, and it should reduce the costs of operations. So that'll feed through into lower prices, hopefully.
Not to confuse people, the hope for the future is that we go backwards to go forwards.
Exactly. It's a great paradox, but there's so much truth in it.
Neil Hamilton, thank you very much for speaking to Llanelli Online. It's a pleasure as always. Thank you.
My great pleasure too.